The text came at 5:47 p.m. I remember because the oven timer had just beeped, a soft chime that usually comforted me, signaling another perfectly baked lemon tart, my mother-in-law's favorite. The scent of citrus and sugar lingered in the air, sharp and sweet, filling our quiet kitchen. I was wiping my hands on a towel when my phone buzzed beside the sink. "Don't come tonight. You'll just make things uncomfortable." At first, I didn't even process it. I blinked at the message, my mind trying to sort through the confusion. It was from Ethan, my husband, the man whose shoes sat by the door, whose coffee mug still rested half full on the counter. Maybe he'd meant to send it to someone else, I thought. Maybe it was about work. A dinner meeting? A client? I told myself not to overthink, not to fall into old insecurities. But the longer I stared at that message, the colder my chest felt. I typed a reply. "Uncomfortable? What do you mean?" Before I could hit send, the front door opened. Ethan stepped inside, brushing off the autumn chill. He smelled faintly of his cologne, the one I'd bought him last Christmas, but underneath it was something unfamiliar. A floral note. Not mine. "Hey," I said carefully, watching his face. "Hey," he echoed, eyes darting toward the kitchen table, the tart cooling beneath the soft kitchen light. "You made that again?" His tone wasn't warm. It wasn't cruel either. Just distant. "It's for your mom's birthday," I reminded him. He hesitated, jaw tightening. "Right. About that." My heart started pounding. "What about it?" I asked. He set his keys down slowly, deliberately. "I think it's better if you don't come tonight." For a moment, I thought he was joking. I laughed, a brittle, awkward sound that died halfway out of my throat. "You're serious?" "Mom's been tense lately. You know how she gets. It might just be easier for everyone if it's family only." "I am family," I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his phone, thumb scrolling absently, as though this conversation were already over. My pulse thudded in my ears. "Ethan, did I do something? Is she upset about something I said?" "No, Emily. It's just complicated." He looked up then, his expression carefully neutral. "Let's not make this a thing." A thing. Like I was being unreasonable. Like my exclusion from his mother's birthday, something I'd helped plan for years, was a minor inconvenience, not a message wrapped in ice. He walked upstairs a moment later, leaving me standing there among the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. I sat at the table, staring at the tart. The glaze had cooled, hardened into a glossy finish. It was perfect. Pointless. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan. My heart lurched as I read it. "She still thinks she's invited." No name. No punctuation. Just that. And then, realization, heavy and nauseating, hit me like a slow, cruel wave. She. Who was she? I felt my throat close as I scrolled up, checking if there was some clue. Nothing. Just those words staring back at me. I dropped the towel, my hands shaking. The scent of lemon suddenly made me sick. When Ethan came back downstairs in a pressed shirt, he avoided my eyes. "I'll be home late," he said. "Don't wait up." I nodded mutely, watching him leave, the door clicking shut behind him. His car engine roared to life, fading into the distance. The house fell into that deep kind of silence you can hear, heavy, echoing, suffocating. I sat on the couch and stared at my phone again. A part of me wanted to call him, demand the truth. Another part, the quieter, older part, told me not to. I'd learned long ago that Ethan didn't like confrontation. He liked control. So I waited. I folded the towel. I cleaned the already spotless counter. I pretended everything was fine because pretending was easier than accepting that maybe my marriage was unraveling. Later that night, I heard him come in. His footsteps were careful, almost guilty. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. He climbed into bed beside me, the mattress dipping under his weight. His breathing steadied quickly, the calm rhythm of a man with no worries. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my heart thrumming painfully, his phone screen occasionally lighting up on the nightstand. At 2:13 a.m., he rolled over, facing the other way. His hand brushed mine in his sleep, and I felt a surge of conflicting emotions: longing, resentment, disbelief. I used to know every inch of him. Now, he felt like a stranger wearing my husband's skin. When dawn crept through the blinds, pale and soft, I heard the shower start. Steam filled the bathroom. The sound of running water masked my breathing. And that's when I did it. I reached for his phone. It was unlocked. He'd grown careless, or confident. My fingers trembled as I opened his messages. The first name that popped up was Claire. My stomach dropped. Claire, my old best friend. The one who'd stood beside me at our wedding, who'd helped me pick the dress. The first message read, "You handled it perfectly. She has no idea." The next, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Love you." My world splintered. The water in the shower stopped. Panic rushed through me, cold and immediate. I set the phone back exactly where it had been and sat frozen as he walked out, towel around his waist, humming like nothing was wrong. "Morning," he said casually. I couldn't answer. He smiled faintly, misreading my silence as something else. "You look tired. Try to rest today, okay?" Then he kissed my forehead, a gesture that used to mean love, and it felt like a lie pressed against my skin. As he left for work, I stared at the door long after it closed, my reflection caught faintly in the glass. The lemon tart still sat on the counter, untouched. Its surface cracked slightly, just enough to ruin its perfection. "Just like us," I whispered to no one. "She still thinks she's invited." And that's when I realized I wasn't the wife anymore. I was the ghost haunting her own marriage. If I'm honest, the story of how Ethan betrayed me didn't start with a text message. It started long before that, years before, in small, almost invisible ways that didn't feel like betrayal until they had accumulated enough weight to crush me. When I first met Ethan Reed, I was 22, all energy and ideas. I was working toward my degree in interior design, with paint swatches tucked into my bag and dreams far too big for the small apartment I shared with two other girls. Ethan was in business school then, sharp in a way that made people listen when he spoke. He had a confidence I mistook for depth, a kind of certainty that felt magnetic to someone like me, still fumbling toward her identity. He noticed me one afternoon in the campus cafe, sketching a layout for a hotel lobby concept. "You have an architect's patience," he said, leaning over my notebook. I remember laughing, flustered and flattered. He asked me to coffee, then dinner, and before I knew it, he had mapped himself into every part of my life. I should have noticed how easily he took up space, how quickly my plans bent around his. When he graduated, he took a job at a small firm in the city. I followed him, shelving my own ambitions with the quiet logic that love sometimes means compromise. I told myself I can always design later. Later became someday. Someday became never. We married 2 years after that, in a church surrounded by white roses and promises I thought were unbreakable. I still remember the way he looked at me during our vows, steady, sure, as if he already knew I belonged to him. The ring he slid onto my finger that day felt like a promise, but now I see it for what it was, a circle of gold that slowly tightened into a cage. When Noah was born, Ethan's company had just started to grow. He worked long hours, often missing bedtime, and when I suggested hiring help so I could go back to design work, he smiled that patient, patronizing smile I used to mistake for kindness. He said, using the nickname he reserved for tender moments. "You're such a good mother." Why would you want strangers raising our son? You have the most important job already. It sounded like love then. It sounds like control now. The years that followed blurred together. School drop-offs, laundry, client dinners I hosted but was never truly part of. Ethan liked things a certain way. Soft lighting, muted colors, a wife who dressed elegantly but never drew too much attention. When I'd wear bright colors, he'd comment gently, "You look lovely, but maybe tone it down for dinner with the partners. You know how old-fashioned some of them are." It was never cruel, not at first. Just small edits to my personality, little adjustments that made him look better. And I let him. I told myself he was refining me, polishing my rough edges. What I didn't see was that he was sanding me down until there was nothing left but a reflection of him. Our friends changed too. My old design school friends stopped calling after too many declined invitations. I was always busy or tired. Ethan preferred we spend time with his circle, people who measured worth by success and wives by how gracefully they smiled at jokes that weren't funny. I became quiet because it was easier. My opinions became smaller, my world reduced to our home, our son, and Ethan's schedule. I used to think peace was the absence of conflict. I know now it was just the absence of myself. Still, there were moments when the facade cracked. Once, at a company gala, I caught him talking too closely with a woman from his office, Claire. She had that effortless kind of beauty that made you doubt your own reflection. I remember reaching for his arm, a possessive, fearful gesture I hated myself for. He turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Emily, this is Claire," he said smoothly. "She's just complimenting your design of the house." "Really?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Claire smiled politely. "It's stunning. You have such a clean, feminine touch. I'd love to get your opinion on my place sometime." Ethan laughed then, that low, charming laugh that used to make me melt. "Careful," he said. "She'll redesign your whole life." The joke lingered longer than it should have. After that night, I noticed her name more often, on his phone, in passing mentions, always innocent. I never accused him. I told myself trust meant not asking questions. But I started to feel the distance growing like a cold draft through the cracks of our marriage. The warning signs multiplied. Perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his jacket. A lipstick stain on a wine glass in his car, the same shade Claire wore at the gala. When I asked about it, he said he'd given a coworker a ride to a meeting. "You're being paranoid," he told me gently, almost amused. "You need to relax more." He always said that, "You need to relax," as if my instincts were nerves, not alarms. I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I was imagining things because I'd been alone too much, because I'd lost touch with the woman I used to be. The woman I used to be. Sometimes I'd go into the attic and open the box that held my old design portfolios, pages of sketches, color palettes, textures I could almost feel again. I'd run my fingers over them, tracing the dreams I'd abandoned, and wonder if Ethan had ever loved that version of me, or if he'd fallen in love with the silence he could mold. Looking back now, I think that's when I truly began to disappear. Not when he cheated, but when I stopped believing I deserved to be more than his reflection. By the time the affair fully revealed itself, I wasn't even surprised. Shocked, yes. Broken, absolutely. But not surprised. Somewhere deep down, I'd been waiting for confirmation of a truth I'd already felt living beneath my skin for years. The signs had been whispering all along, and I had trained myself not to listen. The night the sky opened up, it felt as though the world was grieving with me. Rain tapped the kitchen window like impatient fingers, a rhythm that matched the thud in my chest. I sat at the table, staring at the untouched lemon tart I'd baked earlier that day, the one my mother-in-law loved. It should have been on her table right now, surrounded by laughter and silver forks. Instead, it sat between my trembling hands, a silent witness to my humiliation. Ethan had left an hour ago, dressed too neatly for what he called a small dinner with family. He hadn't asked me to come, hadn't even looked up when he walked past me. The echo of his words still hung in the air like smoke. "It's better if you stay home, Emily. Things are already tense with Mom. You know how she gets." I'd nodded, because that's what I always did. Nod, smile, swallow. But as the clock neared 8, Noah came down the stairs, his face lit by the blue glow of his phone. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant. "Isn't that Dad?" I turned toward him. He held out his phone, and the world tilted. There on the screen was Ethan, my husband of 15 years, standing arm in arm with Claire. My Claire. The friend who'd held my hand through miscarriages, who'd painted our living room with me while Ethan was on business trips. Claire, wearing my necklace, the delicate gold chain with the tiny sapphire pendant my mother gave me on my wedding day. They were smiling, laughing, and behind them, the same lemon tart gleamed on the dinner table like an accusation. Something inside me went still. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm. "Noah, go to your room," I said quietly. He looked confused but obeyed, retreating upstairs while I sat frozen in place, staring at that photo as though it might change if I blinked enough times. But it didn't. It was there, undeniable, cruel in its simplicity. My body moved before my mind caught up. I grabbed my coat from the rack, my car keys from the bowl by the door. The air outside was thick with rain and the smell of wet earth. Each drop hit my face like a small slap, but I barely felt it. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I backed out of the driveway. I told myself I just needed to see. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe there was some absurd explanation. But deep down, I already knew. The truth had been waiting, crouched in the dark corners of my marriage for years. The restaurant wasn't far, the same one we'd celebrated anniversaries in, the same place Ethan once told me, over candlelight, that I was the only person who really understood him. Now, through the blur of rain on the windshield, I saw them. Ethan, standing at the end of a long table, his hand resting lightly on Claire's shoulder. His smile was easy, familiar, the same smile he used to save for me. Claire leaned in close, whispering something that made him laugh. Around them, his family looked at her with warmth, approval. I parked across the street, watching through the window as the laughter flickered like the candles on the table. The glass reflected the streetlights, so it almost looked like they were glowing, ethereal, perfect, untouchable. And then Ethan looked up. Our eyes met. For a moment, he froze. But not in guilt. Not even in surprise. It was annoyance, a flicker of irritation, as though I'd embarrassed him simply by existing outside the narrative he'd crafted. He excused himself and came outside, pushing through the restaurant door with that same restrained calm he always used when he wanted to make me feel small. "Emily," he said, voice low but sharp. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I echoed, laughing bitterly. I could ask you the same. Should I have brought a gift for Claire too? "Keep your voice down." He glanced over his shoulder, jaw tightening. "You're making a scene." Rain soaked through my hair, ran down my back. "I wasn't invited," I whispered. "But she was. My best friend, Ethan. My necklace. My life." His eyes hardened, the way they always did when he felt cornered. "You're overreacting. Claire's been helping me with the family business. Don't twist this into something it's not. Don't lie to me." My voice cracked on the words. "I saw the texts. I saw how you look at her." He exhaled through his nose, that practiced sigh of a man pretending to be patient. "You did this to yourself, Emily. You've been distant for years. You checked out. I needed someone who..." "Who what?" I cut him off. "Who doesn't ask questions. Who doesn't exist unless you need her to." The rain was pouring now, drumming on the pavement like applause for my humiliation. People inside were starting to notice, faces pressed to the glass. Claire turned her head slightly, eyes meeting mine, and she didn't even look sorry. She just looked smug. I felt something snap then. Not loud, not visible, but deep, like a thread finally giving way after years of tension. "You erased me," I said softly. Ethan's jaw clenched. "You did that yourself, Emily." And that was it. The words sliced through me, clean and final. I turned away, walked back to the car, and for the first time in my life, he didn't follow. The drive home was a blur, headlights smearing into the rain, the radio silent. My wedding ring felt heavier than ever, pressing into my skin like it wanted to remind me of its existence. When I got home, the house felt unfamiliar, hollow. I walked through it like a stranger, touching the furniture we'd chosen together, the pictures that now felt staged. I paused at the mantel, where our wedding photo stood in its silver frame. Ethan was smiling in that picture, his arm around me, his eyes soft. I remembered that day, how my veil kept blowing into my face, how he'd laughed and said, "You look like a storm I'd walk into." Now I could barely recognize the man in that photo. I sat on the couch, staring at it for what felt like hours. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The rain eased into a soft patter against the windows. I felt hollowed out, not angry, not even sad, just emptied. Finally, I stood. I slid the wedding ring from my finger. My skin beneath it was pale, indented, a ghost of commitment. I placed the ring beside the photo, the small sound of metal on wood echoing louder than it should have. For a long time, I just stood there. Then I whispered, almost to myself, "I won't let this be the end of me." The lemon tart still sat on the counter. I walked over, picked it up, and carried it outside into the rain. I set it on the front step and watched as the water washed the glaze away, sugar dissolving into nothing. It felt like a funeral. Not for my marriage, but for the woman I used to be. And for the first time in years, I felt something that almost resembled peace. Small, fragile, but real. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the silence. Not the kind that hums behind city traffic or whispers through the walls of a house too full of memory. This silence was alive. It pressed against my skin, raw and wide, broken only by the sigh of wind through pine needles and the low murmur of the lake. The cottage had belonged to my Aunt Ruth, a woman everyone described as eccentric, which, in my family, meant she'd refused to marry and lived on her own terms. I used to visit her as a girl, chasing dragonflies on the dock, breathing in the smell of cedar and sun. She'd told me once, "Freedom doesn't always look like happiness, Em. Sometimes it just looks like peace." Now, standing there with a duffel bag and a heart that felt too heavy to carry, I finally understood what she meant. The door stuck when I pushed it open, swollen from years of humidity. Inside, everything was dust-coated but familiar. Faded floral curtains, the ticking of an old clock, a stack of letters bound with twine. I set my bag down, exhaled, and listened to the emptiness greet me. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood made me flinch. I kept expecting Ethan's voice, that sharp edge he used when I disappointed him, that soft tone he used when he wanted something. But there was only the lake, whispering against the shore. The next morning, light spilled through the window like a slow blessing. I made coffee on the old gas stove, using a dented percolator that hissed like an old friend. Outside, the air smelled of wet pine and mud. When I stepped onto the porch, my breath turned visible in the chill. Across the lake, mist curled above the water like smoke. For the first time in years, there was no one to please, no one to fix my hair for, no one to ask, "Where are you going?" I was free, but freedom felt like vertigo. The days passed in quiet rhythm. I cleaned the cottage, swept the floors, scrubbed the counters until they gleamed. My hands ached, but the work steadied me. I found old paint cans in the shed and began restoring the walls, one stroke at a time, pale blue over peeling beige. The The smell of fresh paint filled the rooms like new beginnings. Sometimes, in the evenings, I would walk down to the dock and watch the water shift with the wind. The lake was a mirror of moods, some days calm, some days restless. I began to see myself in it. At night, I'd light a fire and sit in front of it with my sketchbook. I hadn't drawn in years. Ethan used to call it my little hobby. But now, lines began to form again beneath my pencil. Trees, hands, reflections, a woman's face half in shadow. Each page felt like reclaiming a piece of me I'd buried. On the third week, I met Mara. She lived in the cottage up the hill, a retired teacher with wild gray hair and the kind of eyes that saw more than they asked. She'd brought a pie as a welcome, though I suspected she'd known I was here since the day I arrived. "You're Ruth's niece," she said, setting the pie down without waiting for an invitation. I nodded. "Emily." "I figured," she smiled softly. "You've got that same look Ruth had, like someone who's trying to remember how to breathe." We sat at the old wooden table, the pie between us, steam still rising from its crust. "I came here to get away," I admitted. "I needed to start over." Mara didn't pry. She just nodded and said, "Then start slow. Start with today." Her presence became a quiet comfort. Some mornings she'd drop by with coffee, or I'd walk to her garden where she'd hum to the plants like they were old friends. She didn't ask about Ethan, and I didn't offer. But somehow she knew. One night, after she'd left, I took out a box I hadn't opened since the day I left home. Inside were relics of the life I'd escaped: the wedding photo, Ethan's tie clip, a half-empty bottle of his cologne that still smelled like control disguised as love. I placed them all on the hearth. The firelight trembled across the edges of the photo, the two of us frozen in a moment that had long since died. I held a match between my fingers, hesitating. My heart thudded in my ears. Then I struck it. The flame caught quickly, curling the photo's corners inward. Ethan's face was the first to disappear. The smoke rose, sharp and sweet, filling the room with the scent of old endings. I dropped the rest into the fire: the tie clip, the bottle. It cracked as it hit the embers, releasing one final burst of his cologne into the air before it burned away. Watching it felt like breathing for the first time. I sat there until the fire turned to ash, until I couldn't smell him anymore. Then I whispered, "You don't live here anymore." Over the following days, something inside me began to unclench. I chopped wood, painted trim, cooked meals just for myself. My muscles ached in ways they hadn't in years. My body felt heavier, stronger, more mine. I learned the rhythm of solitude, the soft click of the clock, the song of loons at dusk, the whisper of snow against the window panes. Sometimes, I still caught myself glancing at the empty space beside me in bed, expecting the shape of someone who'd never truly been there. But the ache dulled with time, replaced by something quieter: acceptance. Then one morning, as frost silvered the ground, an envelope arrived in the mailbox by the gate. My name, written in Ethan's lawyer's neat hand. Notice of divorce proceedings. Grounds: abandonment. For a moment, the world went still again, not with pain this time, but disbelief at how predictable he was. Ethan had always needed control, even now, trying to script the ending of our story. But when I finished reading, a strange calm washed over me. I smiled. Because for the first time, he was right about one thing. I had abandoned him. I had abandoned the version of myself that needed his approval, his voice, his permission to exist. I set the letter down on the kitchen table beside my coffee mug, then stepped outside. The lake shimmered under the early sun, and I could smell pine and wood smoke in the air. I thought of Aunt Ruth, of Mara, of the girl I used to be before Ethan taught her to shrink. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt alive. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of freedom across the water. I closed my eyes, breathed it in, and whispered to the stillness, not as a prayer, but as a promise. This time, I decide how the story ends. The letter from Ethan's lawyer stayed on the kitchen table for 2 days before I touched it again. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to look at it long enough to remember exactly how it made me feel. Small, angry, free. By the third morning, I brewed my coffee, opened my journal, and wrote across a fresh page. He doesn't get to tell the story anymore. That became my anchor. The divorce papers weren't a threat, they were an invitation. An invitation to take back the pieces he'd carved out of me and call them mine again. I began documenting everything. The finances, the bank transfers I'd ignored for years, the business trips that coincided with large withdrawals from our joint account. I still had access to some of our shared online folders. I'd once thought it was trust that made him leave them open. Now I knew it was arrogance. He'd left a trail. They always do. I started with the folder labeled E.Read Enterprises. Inside, I found invoices from luxury hotels, 2 meals charged for every room, champagne service for 2, all during weeks he'd claimed to be alone on business. I recognized one date. It was our anniversary. The same night he'd called to say, "Sorry, something came up. Rain check, okay?" I remember I'd stayed home, cooking his favorite dinner, keeping the candles lit until midnight. Now, I sat in my aunt's cottage, the scent of pine smoke wrapping around me, scrolling through receipts for dinners he'd shared with her, Claire. The betrayal no longer made me cry. It made me focused. I printed everything, organized it into folders, labeled every lie with its proper name. I began to feel something I hadn't in years. Capable. Mara noticed the shift before I did. "You've got fire in your eyes again," she said one afternoon as we walked by the lake. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm just done being scared." "Same thing," she replied. She was right. It wasn't vengeance I wanted. It was justice. A quiet kind of reckoning that would leave Ethan exposed for what he was, not because I screamed, but because I stood still long enough for him to fall apart on his own. A few weeks later, I returned to the city. The drive back felt surreal. The roads I'd once traveled 100 times felt foreign, like I was trespassing on an old life I no longer belonged to. The house stood just as I'd left it. Neat, staged, soulless. The curtains were drawn, the flower beds manicured within an inch of their life. Ethan had always cared more about appearances than warmth. When I stepped inside, the air was cold. The scent of his cologne lingered faintly, like a ghost I'd already exorcised. I moved through each room methodically, collecting the rest of my things, the few possessions that still felt like mine. My sketchbooks, a silver locket from my mother, the ceramic mug Noah made in kindergarten that Ethan had called too messy for the kitchen shelf. In our bedroom, I found the photo of us he hadn't bothered to remove. It was still there, smiling from the nightstand, a frozen lie. I turned it face down. Then I saw her, Claire's perfume bottle on the dresser, half empty. The same scent I'd worn years ago when she first told me it was her favorite. A scent she'd later adopted as her own, like everything else she'd quietly taken. My hand shook, not with sadness, but with recognition. The woman I'd once called my best friend had been rehearsing this betrayal for years. I found her number in my phone and stared at it for a long time. Then I pressed call. She answered on the third ring, her voice soft, cautious. "Emily." "Hi, Claire." My tone was even. "I didn't think you'd call." I finished for her. "I'm sure you didn't." There was silence. I could hear her breathing. "I just wanted you to know," I said, "that I'm not angry anymore. You can have him." She hesitated. "Emily, it's not." "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't insult me with explanations. Just take care. You'll need it." Then I hung up. It wasn't forgiveness. It was release. After that, everything moved with quiet precision. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Fiona Blake, sharp as glass and calm as water. She listened without judgment, then smiled and said, "We'll make sure you walk away with what's yours." For the first time in months, I slept soundly. The court proceedings took weeks, but each one stripped away a little more of Ethan's carefully crafted mask. The financial records, the property transfers, the affair, all became documented, undeniable. He'd underestimated me, assuming the same woman he'd controlled would fold at the first confrontation. Instead, he watched as I sat across from him in the courtroom, calm, composed, in a navy dress that once made him say I looked too serious. Now, seriousness was my weapon. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I simply said, "I just want what I earned." Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd built his success with my designs, my ideas, my unpaid work in his office under the title supportive wife. But I'd kept everything. Drafts, notes, emails. Fiona presented them all. By the time the session ended, Ethan's expression had cracked. Not in anger, in disbelief. He was watching a version of me he no longer recognized. The settlement was fair, though money no longer felt like the victory. The victory was the silence that followed, the way he had no more words left to twist. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse into a pale winter sun. Snowflakes fell like quiet applause. I didn't look back. That night, I returned to the cottage. The lake was frozen now, a sheet of glass reflecting the moonlight. I poured a glass of wine, sat by the fire, and reread the letter that had once shaken me, notice of divorce, abandonment. I laughed softly. He was right again, in his own twisted way. I had abandoned him, but I had also abandoned fear, shame, and the endless apology of trying to be enough for a man who could never be satisfied. On the mantel above the fire, I placed a single object, my wedding ring. I'd carried it with me this whole time, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. I set it down gently, its gold catching the flicker of the flames. It didn't symbolize love anymore. It symbolized survival. I took one deep breath and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me who I never want to be again." Then I turned away, letting the firelight swallow the past. Outside, the night air was sharp and alive. The moon rippled across the ice, and for a moment, I could almost see my reflection, not the hollow-eyed woman who'd once begged for love, but someone new. Someone whole. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and something faintly sweet. Freedom again. And in that stillness, I realized, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything I was always meant to be. It was a week after the court finalized the divorce when Ethan showed up at the cottage. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before I saw him, that low, deliberate sound that made my stomach tighten in a way I thought I'd forgotten. The afternoon sky was pale and bruised, the lake a mirror of silver ice. He didn't call ahead. Of course, he wouldn't. Ethan never asked for permission to enter my world, he just assumed he belonged there. When I opened the door, he stood on the porch in his long charcoal coat, holding a manila envelope and looking older than I remembered. His hair was grayer, the lines around his eyes deeper. For a moment, I thought of how I used to trace those lines with my fingers, how I once loved the man who lived inside that face. Now I just saw the stranger who had destroyed us. "Emily," he said, his voice low, almost careful. "I didn't invite him in. What are you doing here, Ethan? I thought we should talk." The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Now he wanted to talk, after silence had been my punishment for years. He looked past me into the cottage, as if surprised by how much light it held. "You've made it nice here." "It's peaceful," I said simply. "That's what I needed." He nodded, shifting the envelope in his hand. "I brought some documents you might want to sign. Final property transfers. Fiona said she'd send them, but I thought I should do it myself." I stepped aside just enough for him to hand them over, but he didn't move. Instead, his eyes drifted to the fireplace behind me, the place where, months ago, I'd burned our photo. He hesitated. You burned something, didn't you? Yes. What was it? Your favorite picture of us. He flinched, barely. Why? He asked. I almost smiled at the question. So simple, so utterly blind. Because I wanted to stop pretending we were happy. Silence hung between us, thick as fog. He looked tired then, the arrogance stripped away, leaving something almost human beneath. Claire's gone, he said finally. She left last month. Said she needed space. Space, I echoed softly. Funny how that word changes meaning depending on who's asking for it. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, at my hair loose over my shoulders, at the paint on my hands, the sweater too big for me but soft and warm. I could feel him taking in how unrecognizable I'd become. I didn't come to fight, he said after a long pause. I just wanted to see you. That made me laugh, a sharp, small sound. You wanted to see me? Ethan, you haven't seen me in years. You looked at me every day and never noticed when I disappeared. His lips parted as if to argue, then closed again. For the first time, he seemed unsure. I stepped outside, pulling the door behind me until it clicked shut. The air was cold enough to sting. What do you want from me? I asked quietly. He looked at the lake, his breath visible in the air. I don't know, he admitted. When I saw you in court, you looked free. I guess I wanted to understand how. There it was, the closest thing to honesty he'd ever offered me. You don't understand because you never learned how to lose, I said. You took everything and still thought you were the victim. You couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't orbiting around you. I loved you, he said softly. I shook my head. No, Ethan. You needed me, to admire you, to forgive you, to make you feel like the good man you pretended to be. That's not love. That's control dressed up as devotion. He looked down, his hands in his pockets. Maybe I deserve that. You do, I said, not unkindly. But that's not my problem anymore. The wind rose, rattling the branches above us. I could smell rain on the air, the faint sweetness of pine and damp earth. It reminded me of the night I left, that same electric stillness before a storm. He took a slow step closer, the gravel crunching under his shoes. Is there really nothing left to say? There's plenty, I said. But none of it would change anything. The truth is simple. I loved you, you broke me, and I rebuilt myself without you. That's the whole story. He stared at me for a long time. I watched his throat tighten, the way his jaw trembled slightly before he masked it again. For a moment, I saw the man who once cried in my arms when his father died, and then I remembered how he later mocked me for crying over a lost painting. I didn't soften. I couldn't. I wish you well, I said, meaning it more than I expected. Truly. I just don't wish you back. He blinked, as if the words stung more than any shouted accusation could. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his car. I watched him go, the gray coat, the familiar gait, the way he paused for a second before opening the door, maybe waiting for me to stop him. I didn't. When his car disappeared down the winding road, I stood there for a long time, the silence settling around me like snow. Inside, the fire had burned low. I sat down by the hearth, the unopened envelope beside me, and felt an odd kind of peace, not the dizzying freedom of escape, but the steady calm of survival. I thought of my aunt, the one who'd left me this cottage. She'd lived alone most of her life, painted wildflowers, laughed loud, loved small. People said she was lonely. Now I wondered if she'd simply understood that solitude isn't emptiness, it's space to grow. I walked to the window and looked out over the lake. The ice was beginning to crack in places, thin lines spidering across the surface where water glimmered beneath. Spring was coming. Quiet. inevitable. That's when I knew what I'd do next. I pulled out my sketchbook and began to draw. Not houses, not clothes, stories. Women standing by rivers, women lighting fires, women walking away. Each face carried a trace of mine, and yet none were me. The pages filled quickly, each line a confession, each shadow a truth I'd never said aloud. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, tapping against the window like gentle applause. I lit a candle, the scent of cedar and jasmine curling through the room. And as the light flickered over the walls I'd repainted, I whispered to the quiet, "I'm still here." Not in defiance, not in despair, but in gratitude. Because surviving wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the woman I'd always been meant to become. That night, I took the wedding ring from the mantel one last time. I walked to the lake, where the rain had melted a thin circle of ice near the shore. The moonlight shimmered on the water's surface like liquid glass. I held the ring between my fingers. It was light, almost meaningless now, a relic of a promise neither of us had kept. "Goodbye," I said simply, and dropped it in. The ring hit the surface with a soft plink and disappeared into the dark. The ripples spread outward, wider and wider, until the lake was smooth again. I stood there, the cold air biting at my cheeks, and realized something I'd never felt before. Not sadness, not triumph, but balance. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged entirely to me. I turned back toward the cottage, my footsteps steady, the rain easing into mist. Behind me, the lake was quiet. Ahead of me, dawn was beginning to rise, pale, pink, patient. And as I crossed the threshold of my new life, I smiled. Because I had finally learned the difference between leaving and being free.